She arrived with a worn bag and no references, and saved an entire valley. They looked at her and saw failure. They saw her full figure, her single threadbare travel bag, and they decided, before she ever spoke a word. But what they couldn't see was the only thing that mattered, the razor-sharp mind behind those calm, steady eyes. While a ruthless man with unlimited money was quietly buying everything in Black Ridge, Wyoming, one woman was already 3 moves ahead of him. She didn't arrive on a white horse. She arrived on a dusty stagecoach, looking for honest work. And that was exactly what made her dangerous. If you're ready for a story about courage, justice, and the woman nobody saw coming, drop your city in the comments and let's see how far this story travels. Hit like and follow along. This one's worth staying for. The wind came down from the Laramie Mountains like it had a grudge. It swept across the open plain in long, sweeping curtains of dust and dried grass, rattling the wooden signs above the storefronts of Black Ridge, and sending the few townspeople still outdoors hurrying for shelter. The sky above was a bruised iron gray, heavy with the kind of clouds that promise snow before nightfall. And rolling slowly down the main road through all of it, wheels groaning, horses blowing hard, came the afternoon stagecoach from Cheyenne. It stopped in front of Harmon's General Store with a shudder and a creak of old leather springs. The driver climbed down without ceremony. A traveling merchant stepped out first, pulling his coat tight. An older couple followed. Then, last of all, a young woman descended the iron step and stood in the dirt street of Black Ridge for the very first time. Her name was Naomi Hale. She was 28 years old, a widow of 14 months, and she carried everything she owned in a single canvas travel bag that had seen better decades. She was a full-figured woman, broad-shouldered, soft-faced, with dark brown eyes that moved slowly and carefully across the town, the way a surveyor's eyes move across unfamiliar land. She wore a clean but faded dress the color of sage, practical leather boots, and her dark hair was pinned back in a neat coil beneath a simple hat. She looked, to anyone watching from the doorways of Black Ridge, like exactly the kind of woman life had already worn down considerably. 3 men standing outside the barbershop watched her step off the stage. One of them, a heavy-set man named Clement, who ran the feed store, nudged the man beside him and muttered something low. They both smiled in the way that men sometimes smile when they believe they already know everything important about a person. Naomi noticed them. She always noticed. She simply chose not to react. She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, checked the folded advertisement she'd been carrying in her coat pocket for the past 200 miles, and walked toward Harmon's General Store. The bell above the door announced her arrival to a stout, bespectacled man behind the counter who was tallying a column of figures in a leather ledger. He looked up over his glasses. "Help you?" said Walt Harmon. "I'm looking for Ashmore Ranch," Naomi said. Her voice was measured, unhurried. "I saw an advertisement posted in Cheyenne. Housekeeper position. I'd like to speak with whoever's doing the hiring." Walt Harmon set down his pencil. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite pity, not quite warning, but something in between. "You and one other," he said, though the other one turned around and left soon as she heard whose ranch it was. "And whose ranch is it?" "Grant Ashmore's." He studied her for a moment. "You know that name?" "No," she said simply. "Should I?" Walt leaned against the counter and folded his arms. "Grant Ashmore is about the most difficult man in this county. And this county has no shortage of difficult men. Lost his wife 3 years back. Lost his boy. Only child. About 18 months after that. Fever took the boy before he saw his 5th birthday." He paused. "Since then, Grant's been running that ranch alone. Workers keep quitting. Place is going to seed. He doesn't want company, doesn't want conversation, and from what I understand, doesn't particularly want help. He posted that advertisement because he needs it, not because he wants it." Naomi listened without interrupting. When Walt finished, she nodded once. "How far is the ranch?" she said. Walt blinked. "About 9 miles northeast, but Mrs., she corrected gently. "Mrs. Hale." "Mrs. Hale." He recalibrated. "You sure you want to go out there? Man like Grant Ashmore, he's liable to turn you away at the door and not say 2 words doing it." She tucked the advertisement back into her pocket. "Is there a way to hire a ride out there?" Walt stared at her for a long moment, then slowly shook his head, not in refusal, but in something closer to reluctant admiration. He called to his boy in the back room to hitch up the buckboard. The road to Ashmore Ranch wound through a landscape that might have been beautiful in July. Rolling grass, scattered cottonwood, the distant white crown of the mountains. But in late October, it had the look of something that had already surrendered to winter. The cottonwoods had dropped their leaves. The grass was flat and colorless. The sky stayed low and threatening. Walt's boy, a lanky 15-year-old named Percy, who hadn't spoken more than 4 words since leaving town, finally broke his silence as they rounded a long bend. "That's it," he said. Naomi looked. Ashmore Ranch was large. She could tell that even now, even with everything about it speaking of neglect. The main house was a 2-story structure of dark timber and stone, solidly built, the kind of building meant to stand for generations. But the front porch railing was broken in 2 places. One of the shutters hung crooked. The kitchen garden on the south side was a tangle of dead weeds. A fence line near the road had 3 posts leaning badly and hadn't been repaired. Through the gate, she could see the barn and the bunkhouse beyond, and while both were standing, both looked tired. The whole ranch had the look of a man who had stopped caring, not because he was lazy, but because he was broken. Percy stopped the buckboard at the gate. "I'll wait here," he said, in a tone that made clear he would not be approaching the house under any circumstances. Naomi climbed down, collected her bag, and walked up the path to the front door alone. She knocked 3 times. Nothing. She knocked again, harder. From somewhere inside came the sound of a chair scraping against a wooden floor. Then footsteps. Heavy, unhurried. The door opened. Grant Ashmore was a tall man, lean in the way that hard work and hard grief can make a person lean. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, a jaw covered in several days of dark stubble, and eyes that were the particular shade of gray-green that reminded Naomi of river ice in February. He looked at her with an expression that revealed absolutely nothing except a complete absence of welcome. He took in her figure, her bag, her face. His expression didn't change. "I'm not buying anything," he said. "I'm not selling anything," she replied. "My name is Naomi Hale. I'm responding to your advertisement for a housekeeper." A pause. His eyes moved to the buckboard at the gate, then back to her. "Where'd you come from?" he said. "Cheyenne? Before that, Laramie. Before that, a small farm outside Douglas that isn't mine anymore." Something flickered behind his eyes at that last part, some recognition of a kind of loss. But it was gone so fast she almost doubted she'd seen it. "You have references?" he said. "I have references from 3 employers in Laramie, 2 of whom I can prove are still living. I cooked, cleaned, managed accounts, and helped run a household of 8 for the last family I worked for." She reached into the front pocket of her bag and produced a folded envelope, which she held out to him. He didn't take it immediately. He looked at her for another moment, the long, measuring kind of look that was meant to make people uncomfortable. And then he took the envelope, unfolded it, and read. The wind pushed at Naomi's back. She stood still and waited. Grant folded the letter and handed it back. "The work here is harder than whatever you did in Laramie," he said. "The kitchen hasn't been properly managed in 2 years. The pantry's a mess. The accounts are worse. I'm not interested in someone who'll stay 3 weeks and leave." "Then we're in agreement," she said. "I'm not interested in a position I'll leave in 3 weeks." He studied her again. "The pay is $12 a month and room and board." "14," she said. His eyes narrowed. 14. "The advertisement said 12, she said, but the advertisement also failed to mention that the kitchen hasn't been managed in 2 years and the accounts are a mess. $12 is fair pay for a maintained household. 14 is fair pay for what you're actually describing." A long silence stretched between them. The broken shutter on the second floor banged once in the wind. 14, Grant said finally, and stepped back from the doorway. Naomi Hale picked up her travel bag and walked into Ashmore Ranch. The inside of the house was not quite as bad as she had feared, and not quite as good as she had hoped. The main rooms, a large front parlor, a dining room with a long table built for a family that no longer existed, a study stacked with papers, were dusty but structurally intact. The furniture was good quality, dark wood and solid, though everything needed cleaning. A portrait hung above the fireplace in the parlor, a young woman with light brown hair and a gentle smile, holding an infant in her arms, with a younger, less worn version of Grant Ashmore standing beside her with his hand on her shoulder. Naomi looked at it for only a moment before moving on. The kitchen was the disaster she had expected. The stove needed blacking. Half the cupboards had been restocked wrong, with items in illogical order. There were supplies that had spoiled and hadn't been cleared. The iron pans needed seasoning. The accounts ledger sitting on the kitchen table was a document of pure chaos. Columns crossed out, figures re-added incorrectly, invoices shoved loosely between pages. Naomi set her bag down beside the kitchen table, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. She worked until 2 in the morning that first night, stopping only to eat a cold supper from what she could find in the pantry. She cataloged every item of food. She scrubbed the stove. She organized the cupboards. She began sorting the accounts ledger, creating a separate sheet to track what needed to be reconciled. She did not see Grant again that night, but at some point around midnight, she heard footsteps pass the kitchen door and pause, then continue on. She kept working. Morning came gray and cold. Naomi had slept 4 hours on the narrow bed in the housekeeper's room off the kitchen and was already dressed and working the stove when the back door opened and 2 men came in stamping cold from their boots. The first was older, maybe 55, with a weathered face, a gray mustache, and eyes that assessed everything with the kind of quiet intelligence that comes from decades of watching land and weather and livestock. He stopped when he saw Naomi and his expression opened into something almost like relief. "Well," he said, "you actually stayed." "Silas Boone," said the younger man behind him, maybe 22, dark-haired, with an eager face that still had some boyish roundness to it. He was talking to himself as much as anyone. "Silas, she actually stayed." "I can see that, Ethan." Silas took off his hat. "Ma'am, I'm Silas Boone. I'm the ranch foreman, or what's left of one since half our crew quit by September. This here is Ethan Cole. He's a good hand, young, but good." "Naomi Hale," she said, "coffee's on. Sit down." They sat. She poured coffee and set biscuits on the table. The first batch she'd managed with the restocked pantry. And they weren't perfect, but they were warm and solid and real. Silas wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at her across the table with something frank and serious in his expression. "How much did he tell you?" he said. "About the ranch's condition?" "Some. About what's happening in the valley." Naomi looked at him steadily. "Nothing," she said. "Tell me." Silas and Ethan exchanged a glance. Ethan leaned forward. "There's a man," Ethan began. "Name of Vincent Holloway. Came to Black Ridge about 8 months ago with money nobody could account for. Started buying up ranches." He paused. "Not buying, really. More like, squeezing. He'd find a rancher in trouble, bad season, debt, sick cattle, and he'd show up with an offer. Never quite enough, always take it or leave it, and somehow the ranchers always ended up taking it." "How many has he bought?" Naomi asked. 4, said Silas. 4 ranches in 8 months. The Pickett place, the Morrison spread, the Hendersons, and last month old Caleb Wren's family homestead. He set down his mug. "People are scared. They don't understand why he wants so much land. Some folks think he just wants to run cattle on a bigger scale, but I don't think that's it." "Why not?" Silas was quiet for a moment. "Because the land he's buying, it doesn't form a natural grazing territory. It forms a corridor." He traced a shape in the air with one thick finger. A corridor from the northern pass all the way down to the flats where the new railroad survey was done last spring. Naomi went still. "Railroad," she said quietly. "Nothing confirmed," Silas said. "Nothing public. But there are rumors out of Cheyenne that the Continental Northern Line is planning a spur route through the valley. If that happens, the land value triples," Naomi said. "At minimum." Both men looked at her. "At minimum," Silas confirmed slowly. "Anyone sitting on land along that corridor when the railroad confirms the route is going to be very, very wealthy, and anyone who doesn't own land along it—" He let the sentence finish itself. "An Ashmore Ranch," Naomi said. "Where does it fall?" Ethan pointed through the kitchen window toward the eastern pasture. "Right in the middle of the corridor," he said quietly. She didn't see Grant until noon. He came into the kitchen while she was working on a reconciled accounts sheet, her dark head bent over columns of figures, her writing neat and precise. He poured himself coffee and stood at the far end of the kitchen. He noticed the stove. He noticed the ordered cupboards. He noticed the ledger open on the table and the clean sheets of figures beside it. "You worked through the night," he said. It wasn't a question. "There was a great deal to do," she replied without looking up. A pause. The biscuits this morning were, Silas told me. You could have come to breakfast. I don't eat breakfast with the hands. She looked up at him then, steady and direct. I know this is your ranch and you make the rules, she said, but I'll say this once and then leave it where it falls. A man who eats alone every meal in a house this size isn't saving himself any trouble. He's creating it. Grant stared at her. People in Black Ridge, people anywhere, did not generally speak to Grant Ashmore this way. You're very direct, he said finally. You paid extra for it, she replied, and looked back down at her ledger. He stood there another moment. Then, without another word, he set his coffee mug down on the table, pulled out the chair across from her, and sat down. He didn't say anything. She didn't expect him to. But he was there, present, in the same room, at the same table. See, in a way she suspected he hadn't been in years. She slid him a clean sheet of paper. I found 3 separate billing errors in the supply accounts going back 18 months, she said. You've been overcharged a total of $42 by the feed store in Black Ridge. I can write the letter for you, or you can write it yourself. But you should get that money back. Grant looked at the paper. He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, not yet, but the first thin crack in a wall that had been sealed for a very long time. Write the letter, he said. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Naomi Hale allowed herself a small, quiet smile. Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall on Black Ridge, Wyoming, soft and silent, covering everything, the way trouble always does before anyone thinks to look up. The snow that had started falling at the end of that first afternoon did not stop for 3 days. By the time it let up, Ashmore Ranch was buried under 14 inches of early-season snow. The temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that made iron brittle and breath visible from 10 feet away. And Naomi Hale had already renegotiated the ranch's supply contract with the Black Ridge feed store, recovered $38 of the $42 in overcharges through a carefully worded letter, and reorganized the entire pantry storage system so that nothing would spoil through the winter months. Silas Boone found her in the barn on the 4th morning, checking the condition of the hay stores with a lantern in one hand and a small notebook in the other, making careful marks in a column she'd labeled Winter Inventory, Verified. He stood in the doorway watching her for a moment before she heard his boots on the frozen ground and turned around. You don't have to do that, he said. I know, she replied. That's why I'm doing it. He almost smiled. Almost. Silas Boone was a man who had spent 30 years earning the right to be skeptical of things that looked too good to be true, and Naomi Hale, to his experienced eye, was starting to look dangerously close to exactly what this ranch needed. He was not yet ready to trust that, but he was watching. How bad is it, he said, nodding at her notebook. Not as bad as it looks, which is fortunate because it looks fairly bad. She closed the notebook. You have enough feed to carry the horses and the remaining cattle through February without rationing. After that, it depends on the winter. If it runs long, you'll need to purchase additional hay by mid-March at the latest. She paused. How many head of cattle did you start this season with? 240. And now? A shadow moved across Silas's weathered face. 211. She waited. We've had losses, he said carefully. Some to the weather, some we can't account for. He looked at her steadily. Cattle don't just wander off in November, Mrs. Hale. Not from a fenced range. No, she agreed quietly. They don't. Neither of them said the name that hung between them in the cold air of the barn. They didn't need to. The days that followed were built around work, the kind of deep, repetitive, necessary work that holds a ranch together the way stitches hold a wound. Naomi cooked 3 meals a day and made sure they were real meals, the kind that put weight on a man's bones against the cold. She managed the household accounts with the focused precision of someone who had spent years learning to make limited resources stretch further than they should. She repaired the torn lining of the curtains in the dining room, recorded 2 chairs that had come loose, and began the slow, patient work of bringing order back to the study, sorting Grant's papers into categories, reconciling old receipts, building a clear picture of exactly where Ashmore Ranch stood financially. It was in the study, on the 8th night of her employment, that she found the first real evidence of how deeply the ranch was struggling. She was working late by lamplight, The house settled into its quiet winter silence when she opened a lower desk drawer that had been jammed shut and found a bundle of papers tied with a string. She untied it carefully and spread the documents on the desk. They were notices. 5 of them, spanning the past 14 months. 3 from the bank in Cheyenne regarding a loan taken out after Grant's wife had died, a loan that had been used, she understood reading between the lines, to cover the cost of the boy's illness. 2 from a supplier in Denver who had extended credit that had not been repaid on schedule. The numbers were not catastrophic, not yet, but they were the kind of numbers that became catastrophic quickly, especially if a ranch's cattle kept disappearing and its management kept deteriorating. She sat for a long time with those papers in her hands, thinking. Then she carefully retied the bundle, placed it exactly where she had found it, and closed the drawer. She made a separate page of notes in her own small notebook, blew out the lamp, and went to bed. She said nothing about it to anyone. Not yet. But she began paying very close attention to the ranch's finances with a focus and urgency that she hadn't revealed before. And she began asking Silas quiet questions. Careful, sideways questions about neighboring ranches, about Vincent Holloway, about the rumors from Cheyenne. Silas answered them without asking why she was asking, which told her that Silas Boone was a smarter man than he generally let on. It was Ethan who brought her the piece of information that changed everything. He came back from town on a gray Tuesday afternoon in late November with the supply wagon and an expression on his young face that was caught somewhere between excitement and unease. He found Naomi in the kitchen and sat down at the table and pulled off his gloves and said, without preamble, "Holloway bought the Garrison place." Naomi set down the pot she was holding. "The Garrison homestead? That's north of the Henderson Ranch." "Yes, ma'am." "Which means he now owns a continuous line of property from the old Morrison spread all the way up to the northern pass." Ethan spread his hands flat on the table. 5 ranches, Mrs. Hale. He's bought 5 ranches in less than a year. And I heard something in town. Heard it from Pete Dunbar, who works at the telegraph office. And Pete's not a man who makes things up. He said a survey crew from the Continental Northern Railroad was seen 2 weeks ago doing measurements 3 miles south of here. Not a rumor. An actual survey crew with equipment. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, wind moved through the bare cottonwoods along the drive. "He's not buying land," Naomi said, almost to herself. "He's buying a railroad corridor, and he's doing it before the survey results are made public, which means he has information the ranchers in this valley don't have." "That's what I figure," Ethan said. "But how do you stop something like that? Man's got money. Man's got lawyers. He goes to a rancher who's having a hard season and says, take it or leave it, and what's the rancher supposed to do?" Naomi didn't answer immediately. She picked up the pot again and moved it to the back of the stove and stood there with her back to him for a long moment, thinking with the same focused stillness she brought to everything. Then she turned around. "Is there a meeting place in Black Ridge? A hall or a church or somewhere a group of people could gather?" "There's the cattleman's hall above the hardware store," Ethan said. "Hasn't been used in a couple of years, but it's there. Can you get word to the ranchers who haven't sold, the ones who are still holding on?" Ethan's eyes widened slightly. "I can try. But Mrs. Hale, these are proud people, independent people. Getting Wyoming ranchers to sit in a room together and agree on anything is like—" "I know," she said. "Do it anyway." He looked at her for a moment with that young, open face, trying to read something in her expression. Then he nodded once and stood up and reached for his gloves. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and went back out into the cold. That evening, Naomi went to find Grant. She knocked on the study door and heard the single word, "Come," and pushed it open. He was sitting at the desk with a glass of whiskey and a week-old newspaper, looking like a man who was reading without actually seeing the words. He looked up when she entered, and something in his posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Not softening, exactly, but becoming slightly less closed. In the week she had been at Ashmore Ranch, they had established something that was not quite a relationship and not quite merely professional. A careful, honest, sometimes uncomfortable middle ground where they were mostly direct with each other and occasionally surprised each other. He had come to breakfast in the main kitchen twice. She had fixed a broken shelf in the study without being asked. He had stopped walking past the kitchen door without entering. She had stopped editing herself in his presence. "I need to talk to you about Vincent Holloway," she said. Grant's expression went flat and still. "Sit down," he said. She sat in the chair across the desk from him and laid out everything she knew in clear, organized language without dramatizing it and without softening it. The 5 ranches, the railroad survey, the corridor the purchases formed, the bank notices in the desk drawer, which she mentioned carefully, watching his face. The pattern she had been assembling in her notebook for the past 10 days. When she finished, Grant was quiet for a long time. "You found the bank notices," he said finally. "They fell out of the drawer," she said, which was not entirely true but was close enough. He turned the whiskey glass slowly in his hands. "I was going to resolve them by spring," he said, "if the cattle market holds." "The cattle market may hold," she said carefully, "but if Holloway moves on Ashmore Ranch before spring, he won't." The words came out hard and flat. "This land has been in my family for 22 years. My father built that barn with his own hands. My wife is buried in the east pasture. My son is buried beside her." His jaw was tight. "No man with a checkbook takes this land." "I agree," Naomi said. "But pride alone won't stop him. And fighting him alone won't stop him either. Because the whole point of what Holloway is doing is to isolate each rancher. He comes to you when you're tired and in debt and frightened, and you make a decision under pressure that you'd never make with a clear head and allies beside you." Grant looked at her directly. "What are you suggesting?" "The ranchers who haven't sold need to meet. Not to talk, not to complain. To form an agreement. A united front. If 5 or 6 ranches commit to refusing Holloway's offers simultaneously and publicly, it changes his entire calculation. He can't buy a railroad corridor with gaps in it. One holdout makes the whole corridor worthless to him." A long silence filled the study. "These men don't unite easily," Grant said. "I know some of them. Tom Briggs hasn't spoken to the Kellerman family in 6 years over a fence line dispute. Carl Novak doesn't trust anyone from outside his own county." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm not asking them to trust each other. I'm asking them to trust their own self-interest." She leaned forward slightly. "Every rancher who sold regrets it now. The offers were low because Holloway knew they were desperate. The ranchers who hold on until the railroad route is confirmed publicly will own some of the most valuable land in Wyoming territory. That's the argument. Not community spirit, not neighborly feeling. Their land, their future, their families." Grant studied her face for a long moment. Really studied it, the way he might study a map of unknown terrain, looking for what was solid and what might give way under pressure. Whatever he found there, he held it a while before he spoke. "You really think you can get them in a room together?" he said. "I think Ethan Cole can," she said. "He's well liked. People open their doors to Ethan, but it would help considerably if the invitation came from Ashmore Ranch." She met his eyes. "Your name means something in this valley, Mr. Ashmore. Even now. Maybe especially now." Something moved through Grant's expression. Not vanity, but the particular ache of a man being told he still has something worth offering when he'd spent a long time believing the opposite. He picked up his whiskey glass, looked at it, set it back down untouched. "All right," he said, "set up the meeting." The Cattleman's Hall above Black Ridge's hardware store had not held a gathering in 2 years, and it smelled like old wood and forgotten purpose. Ethan Cole had swept it out and lit the 4 iron lanterns along the walls, and by 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening in early December, 11 people had crowded into its rough benches, 8 ranch owners or their representatives, Silas Boone, Ethan himself, and Naomi Hale, who sat in the back and said nothing at the start. Tom Briggs sat as far from James Kellerman as the room allowed. Carl Novak arrived last and sat near the door with his arms crossed, and an expression that said he would leave at the first sign of foolishness. A woman named Dorothy Wainwright, who ran a mid-sized spread northeast of town since her husband's death 2 years prior, sat near the front with a ledger book on her knee and the composed look of someone who had already done the math and was here to confirm it. Grant Ashmore stood at the front of the room. He was not a natural public speaker, too private for it, too guarded, but he had a quality of stillness that made people pay attention, the way a mountain makes you pay attention without doing anything at all. "I'll be brief," he said. "Most of you know me. Some of you I haven't spoken to in too long, and that's partly on me. Vincent Holloway has bought 5 ranches in this valley in the past year. I believe he plans to buy more. I believe he's operating with information about the railroad expansion that none of us have been given access to, and I believe he is deliberately timing his offers to catch ranchers when they're most vulnerable. A pause. I also believe that if we remain isolated from each other, he'll pick us off one at a time. So I asked you here because I want to know if you're willing to do something about it. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Karl Novak unfolded his arms. What kind of something? He said. This was when Naomi stood up. She had not planned to speak first. She had planned to let Grant lead, to stay in her position at the back of the room, to be the quiet presence with the information. But she saw the room. She read it the way she read a ledger page, quickly and accurately, and she understood that what these people needed in this moment was not the broad strokes. They needed the numbers. She walked to the front of the room and she felt the shift in attention as 11 pairs of eyes adjusted and assessed her. This full-figured woman in a practical dress, nobody's idea of a political organizer, nobody's idea of a threat to anyone. She let them look. She let it settle. Then she opened her notebook. The 4 ranches Holloway purchased before the Garrison homestead, she said, sold for an average of $42 per acre. Based on the railroad survey data and comparable expansion routes in eastern Colorado, land along a confirmed continental northern spur route typically increases to between $140 and $180 per acre within 2 years of confirmation. She looked up. That means every rancher in this room is sitting on land worth 3 to 4 times what Holloway would offer you today. The silence in the room had a different quality now. Dorothy Wainwright looked up from her own ledger. How are you getting those numbers? Publicly available railroad reports from the Colorado expansion, Naomi said, the Wyoming territorial land records, and some straightforward arithmetic. She turned to a clean page. I can show anyone who wants to verify this exactly where every figure came from. Tom Briggs leaned forward. So if you hold, and if the railroad confirms the route, you become wealthy by any reasonable measure, Naomi said. If you sell to Holloway now, you receive approximately 1/4 of what your land will be worth in 24 months. Karl Novak's arms were no longer folded. He was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, and the expression on his face had shifted from skepticism to something sharp and interested. Who are you exactly? He said. I'm the housekeeper at Ashmore Ranch, she said, meeting his eyes, and I know how to read a balance sheet. Someone in the room, she thought it was Ethan, made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. The agreement I'm proposing is simple, she continued, not a formal legal document, a commitment among neighbors. No one in this room accepts an offer from Vincent Holloway, or any representative of his, without first consulting the group. Not because your land isn't yours to sell. It is. But because he is specifically counting on you making that decision alone, under pressure, without information. She paused. Give yourselves the information. Give yourselves the time. That's all. The discussion that followed was not quiet, and it was not always civil. Tom Briggs and James Kellerman managed to disagree about 2 separate things that had nothing to do with Holloway before Dorothy Wainwright cut across them both with a practicality that silenced the room for a full 30 seconds. Karl Novak had detailed and legitimate questions about what the commitment actually meant legally, which Naomi answered carefully and honestly, including being honest about the things she didn't know for certain. But by 9 o'clock, every person in that room had signed their name to a single sheet of paper that Naomi had drafted by hand. A statement of mutual consultation, 11 names in a column, witnessed by Silas Boone. It was not a legal contract. It had no enforcement mechanism. It was simply 11 people in a cold hall above a hardware store in Black Ridge, Wyoming, agreeing to stop being alone. Walking back to the buckboard through the frozen street, Grant fell into step beside Naomi. He didn't speak for most of the walk. The town was quiet around them, lamplight in windows, the distant sound of a piano from the saloon at the far end of the street. When they reached the buckboard, he stopped and looked at her directly. That was well done, he said. It came out straightforward, without the usual guardedness, like a man who had gotten out of the habit of giving compliments and was slightly rusty at it. It was a start, she said, climbing up onto the seat. It won't be enough on its own. No, he agreed, climbing up on the other side and taking the reins. I don't suppose it will. He clucked to the horses and the buckboard moved out onto the dark road toward home. Neither of them spoke again for a long time, but it was the kind of silence that had changed its character. No longer the silence of 2 strangers sharing a space, but the particular silence of two people who had done something together and were still feeling the shape of it. Naomi sat with her notebook on her knee and watched the dark Wyoming landscape moving past, and thought about what she had seen in Holloway's pattern, the part she hadn't mentioned yet in the meeting hall, the part that kept her awake in her narrow bed in the hours before dawn. A man who was simply greedy bought land. A man who was strategic bought specific land. But a man who bought specific land and timed every purchase to a rancher's most vulnerable moment, who moved so quietly that nobody had connected the purchases into a pattern until now, that man was not done. He was not close to done. And somewhere between the cold dark of the road and the lamplight of Ashmore Ranch appearing ahead through the cottonwoods, Naomi Hale understood with a certainty she couldn't yet prove that Vincent Holloway already knew about the alliance, or would know soon, and that when he moved next, he would not come with a checkbook. She had been right about one thing above all else. Holloway would not come with a checkbook. The first sign arrived 9 days after the meeting in the cattleman's hall, on a Monday morning so cold that the water in the horse troughs had frozen solid overnight, and Ethan had to break the ice with the back of an axe before the animals could drink. Silas came in from the north pasture before breakfast with his jaw set and his eyes carrying the particular flatness of a man delivering news he wishes he didn't have. 7 head gone, he said, standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands. The north fence line on the upper pasture has been cut, clean cut. Wire cutters, not breakage, done sometime in the night. Grant was already at the table. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said very carefully, "How many does that leave us?" 204. The number settled into the kitchen like a stone dropped into still water. Naomi poured coffee and set it in front of Silas without being asked, then sat back down with her notebook and made a careful entry: date, number of missing cattle, location of fence damage, estimated time of occurrence based on Silas's description of the frozen ground around the cut posts. "Did you find tracks?" she asked. "Snow covered most of them, but not all." Silas wrapped his hands around the mug. "At least 2 horses, riders who knew what they were doing and knew where they were going." "They weren't rustling for themselves," Grant said. It was not a question. "No," Silas agreed. "Rustlers take the whole herd if they can, or as much as they can move fast. 7 head is a message." Grant's hands were flat on the table. He was holding himself very still in the way Naomi had come to recognize, the stillness of a man keeping himself from reacting in a direction that wouldn't help him. She had come to respect that about him, even as she understood how much it cost him. "We need to report it to the county sheriff," she said. "Roy Callum." Silas's expression suggested what he thought of that option. "Is he Holloway's man?" she asked directly. A pause. "Not that anyone can prove," Silas said, "but he's a man who knows which way the wind is blowing and dresses accordingly." "We report it anyway," Naomi said. "In writing, dated and signed. Not because Callum will do anything about it, but because we need a record." She looked at Grant. "Everything that happens from here on out needs a record. Every incident, every date, every witness. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Grant met her eyes. "You're saying we're going to need evidence." "I'm saying that a man like Holloway doesn't operate without creating traces," she said. "He's careful, but careful men still leave traces. And when the time comes, and it will come, we need to be the ones holding the documentation." She said it calmly, practically, the way she said most things. But underneath the calm was something that had been building in her since that night on the dark road home from Black Ridge, the certainty she'd been carrying quietly and alone. She had seen the shape of what Holloway was doing, and she understood now that it was larger and more deliberate than even the ranchers in that meeting hall had grasped. This was not opportunism. This was a plan that had been assembled carefully over a long time by someone who did not intend to fail, which meant that stopping him could not be improvised. It had to be assembled just as carefully. She began keeping 2 notebooks after that. The first was the household accounts, supply lists, financial reconciliations, the ordinary business of the ranch. The second was something else entirely, a thin cloth-covered book she kept in the inside pocket of her coat, in which she recorded every incident in the valley with the methodical precision of someone constructing a legal case. She noted dates and times and witnesses. She wrote down what Ethan heard in town and what Silas observed in the field, and what Dorothy Wainwright reported when she rode over one afternoon with the news that 2 of her wells had been fouled with something chemicals or dead animals, she couldn't tell which, that had turned the water brackish and undrinkable.
"Both wells," Dorothy said, sitting at Naomi's kitchen table with her riding gloves still on, her face composed but her eyes frightened in a way she was working hard not to show. "My winter water supply is cut in half. I've got cattle that need water and a household to run, and I can't—" She stopped, started again. "I've been on that land for 11 years. My husband is buried there. My children were born there. And now I am sitting in someone else's kitchen trying to decide if I should just—" "No," Naomi said quietly. It was a single word spoken without drama, but it had a weight to it that stopped Dorothy mid-sentence. "You're not going to sell, and you're not going to make that decision right now, today, while you're frightened and cold and your wells are poisoned. That's exactly what he wants you to do." Dorothy looked at her for a long moment. "How are you so certain?" she said. "You're—" She stopped herself. "I'm the housekeeper," Naomi finished for her without bitterness. "I know. I wasn't going to say that."
"It's all right if you were." Naomi poured more coffee. "I'm certain because this is what the pattern says. Every attack follows the same logic. Isolate, frighten, offer a way out before the person has time to think clearly. He is counting on each of us making a decision in panic. The moment we stop making decisions in panic, his entire strategy falls apart." She paused. "Can your cattle share the river pasture with Ashmore stock for the next few weeks while the wells are dealt with?" Dorothy blinked. Yes, I suppose they could." "Then that's what we'll do." She looked at Silas, who was standing in the kitchen doorway. "Talk to Grant." Silas nodded and left. Dorothy sat at the table looking at Naomi with an expression that had shifted from fear into something more complicated. Something like the feeling of finding solid ground when you thought you were standing on ice. "You knew this was coming," Dorothy said, "before it happened." "I knew something was coming," Naomi said. "I didn't know exactly what." She opened her thin notebook to a clean page. "Tell me everything about the wells. When you first noticed. What the water looked like. Whether anyone had been seen near that pasture in the past 2 weeks." The attacks did not let up. Through December and into the first weeks of the new year, the valley experienced a relentless series of misfortunes that none of the remaining ranchers were prepared to accept as coincidence. A hay barn on the Novak property burned to the ground on a windless night. The fire starting, Silas observed after riding out to look, from 2 separate points simultaneously, which no natural fire did. The Briggs family found their main gate posts cut at the base and laid flat, their cattle loose across the road for 3 miles. James Kellerman's prize breeding bull was found dead in the south pasture, no visible injury, the ground around it undisturbed. And the county veterinarian, a nervous man who Naomi noticed had recently begun avoiding eye contact with the ranchers, called it a natural cardiac event and produced his report within 48 hours, which was faster than any such report was typically produced. Naomi wrote all of it down. She wrote down the veterinarian's name and the speed of his report. She wrote down the 2 ignition points on the Novak barn. She wrote down the distances and the dates and the witnesses, cross-referencing everything against a timeline she had constructed of Holloway's land purchases, building a document that was growing, page by careful page, into something that looked very much like proof. She also began, quietly and without telling anyone her full intention, sending letters. The first went to a land attorney in Cheyenne named Hargrove, whose name she had found referenced in a back issue of the Wyoming Territorial Gazette as someone who had represented ranching interests against a railroad company in a boundary dispute 3 years prior. The letter was factual and specific and did not use emotional language. It described what was happening in the valley, listed the incidents with dates, and asked whether any of it constituted actionable fraud or criminal conspiracy under territorial law. The second letter went to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, requesting a copy of all publicly filed deed transfers in the valley over the past 14 months. The third went to a reporter at the Cheyenne Daily Leader named Marcus Webb, who had written 2 years prior about corrupt land speculation in Nebraska, and whose byline Naomi had saved from a newspaper Walt Harmon had left on the store counter 4 weeks ago. She sent all 3 letters on the same day from the post office in Black Ridge, with the return address of Ashmore Ranch. She told no one she had sent them,
She sealed each one with wax and handed them to the postmaster with the same practical, unhurried expression she brought to every other errand. And she went home and made dinner and said nothing. It was the barn fire that changed everything.
It happened on a Thursday night in late January, when the temperature had dropped to 20 below zero and the sky was so clear and dark that the stars looked close enough to touch. Naomi woke at 2:30 to the smell, the particular, unmistakable smell of wood smoke where wood smoke should not be. And she was out of bed and into her coat and boots before she was fully conscious. She came around the side of the ranch house and saw it. The eastern bay of the main barn, the oldest section, built by Grant's father, throwing a column of orange fire into the black winter sky. "Fire!" she screamed, already running. "Silas, Ethan, fire!"
The next 40 minutes were the most physically demanding of her life. Silas and Ethan were out of the bunkhouse in under a minute, Grant right behind them, and together they formed a bucket line from the frozen water tank. Ethan breaking ice with the axe while Grant and Silas hauled, while Naomi went directly to the barn's main doors and threw them open. The horses were in the western section, away from the fire, but the smoke was already reaching them and they were panicking, wide-eyed, kicking, screaming in that high, terrible way that horses scream when they're afraid. Naomi had grown up around horses and she did not hesitate. She moved into the smoke-filled dark and took the first one by the halter and pulled, speaking low and constant, a steady rhythmic murmur of words that weren't quite sentences but were the right sound, the human sound, the sound that meant, "Follow me and you will not die here." She got 4 horses out herself before Grant appeared at her shoulder and wordlessly took the next 2. Between them, they cleared the barn in 8 minutes. Every horse survived. The eastern bay burned to its frame before they contained it. The structure groaned and one wall came down in a cascade of red sparks that floated up and died against the winter sky. By the time dawn came, gray and exhausted, Naomi and Grant and Silas and Ethan were standing in the snow looking at what remained. A blackened skeleton of the oldest section of the barn, surrounded by a wide ring of scorched, ruined earth. Grant said nothing for a long time. He stood with his arms at his sides and his face turned toward the ruin, with an expression that Naomi could not fully read, but felt, somewhere in her chest, as something close to breaking. Then she saw his jaw tighten, and his eyes, when he turned them away from the wreckage, had a quality in them that was not grief and not anger exactly, but the combination of both that becomes, in the right person, something like iron. "How did it start?" he said. 2 points, Silas said. "Same as the Novak barn." Grant nodded slowly. He looked at Naomi. She was covered in ash, and her hair had come down from its pins, and there was a burn mark on the sleeve of her coat from where a falling ember had caught her as she came out with the last horse. She looked, he thought, like someone who had just fought a war. She also looked like someone who was already thinking about the next one. "I found something before I came outside," she said. Both men looked at her. "When I came around the corner of the house before I raised the alarm, I saw a horse." She kept her voice steady. "One rider moving away fast along the north tree line. I couldn't see the man's face, but I could see the horse. It was a dark roan with a white blaze, and it had a distinctive way of moving, favoring the left foreleg slightly. A horse that's been worked on hard ground too young." She looked at Grant steadily. "Have you seen a horse like that in Black Ridge?" Grant thought. "Tucker Marsh," he said slowly. "He runs errands for Holloway. I've seen him in town twice." Silas made a sound low in his throat. "Tucker Marsh is a hired hand. If they send him to do this, they're getting confident, sloppy." "Or they want us to react," Naomi said. "Go to Callum, make accusations we can't prove yet. Look unstable." She looked at both of them. "We are not going to do that." "What are we going to do?" Ethan said. He had come up quietly behind them, and his young face, in the pale dawn light, was tight with something that was equal parts fury and fear. Naomi looked at the ruined barn. She thought about Dorothy Wainwright's poisoned wells and the Novak barn fire, and the Kellerman bull and the cut fences and the 7 head of cattle vanished into a winter night. She thought about the thin notebook in her coat pocket, growing heavier with every entry. She thought about the 3 letters she had sent to Cheyenne and whether anyone had received them yet, and what they would say when they wrote back. And she thought about something else.
Something that had come to her in the early morning hours, when the pattern of Holloway's attacks had suddenly shifted in her mind from a list of separate incidents into a single, unified picture. A picture that had one more element she hadn't yet seen clearly, but that she now, standing in the ash and cold of this ruined January morning, was beginning to understand. "We're going to let him think it's working," she said. The others looked at her. "He wants us frightened, isolated, making bad decisions," she said. "So we're going to appear frightened. We're going to appear isolated. Grant," she turned to him, "I need you to make an appointment at the Blackridge Bank, publicly. Let it be known you're discussing your loan situation. Let it be known that things are difficult here." Grant's eyes narrowed. "You want me to look weak?" "I want Holloway to think you're weakening," she said. "There's a considerable difference." She glanced at Silas. "I also need you to hear something if it comes your way. Any word that Holloway is preparing to move on Ashmore Ranch specifically. Any offer, any legal maneuver, anything. I need to know the moment there's a whisper of it." "What are you planning?" Silas asked. Naomi looked at the burnt frame of the eastern barn bay, and she looked at the winter sky above it, pale and cold and enormous. And she thought of the letters in Cheyenne that hadn't yet been answered, and the evidence in her notebook that was almost enough. "I'm planning to let him spring the trap he's already building," she said quietly. "And while he's busy doing that, I'm going to build a larger one around it." No one spoke. The wind moved across the snow, and the barn timbers settled in their ash with a low, exhausted sound. Then Grant said, very quietly, "How long do you need?" She looked at him. His face was still carrying the morning's grief, still marked by smoke and cold and loss. But his eyes, when they met hers, were steady and clear and fully present. The eyes of a man who is deciding, deliberately, to trust someone. She held that trust carefully, the way you hold something that cannot be dropped. 6 weeks, she said. Maybe less. He nodded once. It was the nod of a man who has made a decision and intends to stand by it. Silas looked between them, and something in his weathered face, some long-held caution, finally eased. He put his hat back on. "All right," he said. "What do you need me to do?" Naomi opened her coat and took out the thin notebook and turned to a clean page. In the background, behind the ruined barn and the wide gray sky, the valley lay in its winter silence, waiting, the way all things wait, for the season to turn. 6 weeks, she had said. It took 5.5. The first letter back came from Attorney Hargrove in Cheyenne 12 days after Naomi had sent hers. It arrived on a Tuesday, carried in the regular post sack that Percy Harmon delivered to the ranch on his way back from town, and Naomi took it from the stack of mail with the same unhurried expression she brought to everything and carried it to the kitchen and read it twice before she allowed herself to feel anything about what it said. Hargrove's letter was 4 pages, written in the precise, economical language of a man who charged by the hour and had learned not to waste words. He confirmed what Naomi had suspected. The pattern of incidents she described, taken collectively, could constitute criminal conspiracy to commit fraud under territorial law and potentially wire fraud if telegraph communications had been used to coordinate the land purchases. He also noted, with a specificity that made Naomi sit down slowly at the kitchen table, that he had himself received 3 separate inquiries over the past 8 months from ranchers in the Black Ridge Valley who had been approached by a company called Western Meridian Land Holdings. Inquiries that, taken individually, he had not been able to act on, but that taken together with her letter formed a pattern he was prepared to take seriously. He asked for the documentation she had described. He asked whether she was prepared to act as a coordinating witness. And at the bottom of the 4th page, in a slightly less formal hand, as though he had added it after the letter was otherwise finished, he wrote, "I have reason to believe you are not the only person currently investigating Western Meridian Land Holdings. You may receive contact from a federal land office investigator named Patterson. If you do, he is legitimate, and you should speak with him freely." Naomi read that last paragraph 3 times. Then she folded the letter, placed it in the inside pocket of her coat alongside her thin notebook, and went back to making dinner as though nothing had changed. But her mind was moving at a speed and in a direction that she kept entirely off her face, working through the implications the way she worked through a column of figures, methodically, building from what was certain toward what could be proven. Western Meridian Land Holdings. She wrote the name down that evening in her notebook. She had seen it on 2 of the deed transfer documents she'd received from the Territorial Land Office, the company name under which 3 of the 5 Valley purchases had been officially recorded. She had noted it without yet understanding its full significance. Now she understood. Holloway was not operating alone and not operating under his own name. Western Meridian was a shell, and somewhere behind it were other investors, other money, other people who would be very motivated to ensure this remained quiet, which meant the evidence she was building needed to be not just convincing, but unassailable. She wrote to Hargrove the same night with a package of copied documents, not her originals, which she kept, and a detailed timeline of every incident in the valley, cross-referenced against the deed transfer records from the Territorial Land Office. She made 3 separate copies of the entire package before sealing the one she sent. One copy she stored in the false bottom of the kitchen supply chest she had built quietly over 2 weeks by repositioning the interior shelf. The second she gave to Silas on a cold morning in the barn with instructions to keep it somewhere no one from the ranch house would think to look, and he took it without asking questions, which she had counted on. The third she prepared to send to Marcus Webb at the Cheyenne Daily Leader, but held back. Not yet, not until the moment was exactly right. Meanwhile, she played the role she had assigned herself. She said nothing to Grant about Hargrove's letter or the package she had sent. She needed Grant to behave naturally, to perform the vulnerability she had asked of him without the complication of knowing how close the net was drawing. He was not a man built for concealment. His grief and his anger and his care were all too close to the surface for him to hide things smoothly. So she protected him from what she knew, the way you protect someone you trust, by carrying the weight they don't yet need to carry. Grant went to the bank in Black Ridge as she had asked, and he did not have to perform difficulty because the difficulty was real. The bank manager, a thin, nervous man named Elbert Coombs, expressed what Grant later described to Naomi as a considerable amount of sympathy and very few concrete solutions. Coombs mentioned with studied casualness that there were buyers interested in Wyoming ranch land who might offer favorable terms. Grant came home tight-jawed and said he had handled it, and Naomi said she was glad to hear it, and neither of them mentioned Holloway's name. But 3 days later, a man came to the ranch. He arrived in a good carriage, well-dressed for the winter weather, with a driver who waited by the horses and a briefcase that was too expensive for Black Ridge. He gave his name at the door as Mr. Clayton Reed, and he said he was a representative of Western Meridian Land Holdings, and he wondered if Mr. Ashmore might have a few minutes. Grant came to find Naomi before he let the man in. He found her in the study, where she had been reorganizing the filing system, and he stood in the doorway and said very quietly, "He sent someone." She looked up. "What name?" "Clayton Reed." She was still for exactly 3 seconds. Then she stood and straightened her dress and said, "Let him in. Put him in the front parlor. Offer him coffee." A pause. "And Grant, be tired. Be worried. Be a man who is seriously considering his options. Can you do that?" He looked at her for a moment with those gray-green eyes that had, over the weeks, lost some of their river ice quality and taken on something warmer and more complicated. "Can I do that?" he repeated, with a trace of something that was almost, in another man, a dry smile. Then he turned and went to let Clayton Reed inside. Naomi stayed in the study and listened through the slightly open door. Reed was smooth. She had to acknowledge that. He expressed sympathy for the difficulties facing small ranchers in the current climate, the hard winter, the cattle losses, the general uncertainty. He mentioned Western Meridian's strong record of fair dealing with the properties they'd acquired. He said, in the tone of a man reluctantly sharing a confidence, that he had it on good authority that the Continental Northern Railroad would be announcing its spur route within the next 90 days, and that while Western Meridian was obviously very interested in properties along that corridor, they were also very aware that timing was everything, and that an offer made today would necessarily reflect current market conditions rather than speculative future values. He was offering Grant a way to believe he was getting ahead of the news, when in fact he was being asked to sell before the news made his land worth 4 times the offered price. Grant said very little. He said he appreciated Reed's time and that he had a great deal to think about. He said the winter had been harder than he expected, and he was a man who understood the value of a fair offer when one was made. He said nothing definite. Reed left a card in a sealed envelope which he said contained a formal offer in writing, and he shook Grant's hand and was driven away down the snow-packed road toward Black Ridge. Grant came into the study and closed the door and put Reed's sealed envelope on the desk and looked at Naomi. "Well?" he said. She picked up the envelope. She held it for a moment, not opening it, just feeling its weight, its intention, the particular coldness of a document designed to end something. "He mentioned 90 days until the railroad announcement," she said. "I caught that. That means Holloway knows the announcement is coming, which means he has a source inside the Continental Northern or the territorial government." She set the envelope back down. "It also means he's feeling time pressure. He needs Ashmore Ranch before the announcement, not after, which means whatever he's planning to force your hand, it's coming soon." Grant leaned against the desk and crossed his arms. "What is he planning?" "I don't know exactly," she said. "But there's the type of move a man like this makes when he can't buy something and can't frighten someone into selling." She looked at him directly. "He manufactures a legal reason for you to lose it." The words sat between them. "A foreclosure," Grant said slowly. "Or something like it. A debt called in early. A contract dispute. A fraudulent lien." She paused. "The bank meeting you had with Coombs, I think that was reconnaissance. Holloway needed to know exactly how much debt you're carrying and whether the terms could be manipulated." Grant's jaw was tight. "Coombs. I don't know that for certain," she said carefully, "but I'm watching him." She had been watching Elbert Coombs for 2 weeks. In the indirect, patient way, she watched everything that might matter. She had noted that Coombs had been in the saloon twice in the past month, at the same time as 2 men she had identified as Holloway's associates, Tucker Marsh and a lawyer named Dillard, who had appeared in Black Ridge in November and taken an office above the dress shop. She had noted that Coombs had processed the deed transfers for 2 of the Valley Ranch sales in an unusually short time. She had noted all of this in her thin notebook without yet having the piece that connected it. That piece came 6 days later, carried by a stranger. He arrived at the ranch on horseback, alone, in the middle of a weekday afternoon, a compact, unremarkable-looking man in a gray coat who gave his name to Ethan at the gate as Daniel Patterson and asked whether Mrs. Hale was available to speak with him. Ethan came for Naomi with an expression of pure bewilderment. "Man at the gate asking for you by name, Mrs. Hale. Not for Mr. Ashmore. For you." She felt the name register against Hargrove's letter. "You may receive contact from a federal land office investigator named Patterson," and kept her face entirely neutral. "Bring him in," she said. "Put him in the kitchen." Patterson was perhaps 40, with a forgettable face that she suspected was professionally cultivated and eyes that were not forgettable at all. Dark, quick, taking in the kitchen and everything in it with the practiced efficiency of a man who is always building a picture. He sat at the kitchen table when she gestured to a chair, and he folded his hands on the table and said, without preamble, "Mr. Hargrove said you might be the most organized person working on this problem. I think he understated it." "What problem are we talking about?" she said, setting coffee in front of him. "Because some things you did regardless." "Vincent Holloway and Western Meridian Land Holdings," he said, "and a federal mail fraud case that my office has been building for 4 months. He looked at her steadily. "We have the purchases. We have the shell company structure. We have a connection to a corrupt territorial land assessor in Casper who was providing Holloway with confidential survey information." He paused. "What we don't have is a clean chain of the coercive tactics used against the individual ranchers, the incidents, the intimidation. Without that, the mail fraud charges stand, but the conspiracy charges don't. And without the conspiracy charges, Holloway walks away with a fine and the land he's already bought." Naomi was quiet for a moment. Then she stood and went to the kitchen supply chest and opened it and removed a bound set of papers from the compartment beneath the shelf and placed them on the table in front of Patterson. He looked at the document. He looked at her. He picked it up and began reading. And as he read, his expression, already controlled, grew more controlled, which she had learned to recognize as the investigator's version of surprise. It took him 11 minutes to read through it. "This is every incident," he said. "Dated, witnessed, cross-referenced. Every incident I know of," she said. "There may be things on other properties I haven't been told about. The arson assessments are my own observations, not official. I noted the 2 ignition points on both the Novak barn and the east bay of this ranch's barn. A qualified investigator would need to confirm them formally. Patterson set the document down with the particular carefulness of a man handling something he intends to use in court. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "how long have you been at this ranch?" 14 weeks, she said. He was quiet for a moment. 14 weeks, he repeated, as though running some private calculation. Then he looked up. "We need one more thing. Holloway is going to make a move on Ashmore Ranch. We believe it's a forged foreclosure document, which would be the cleanest way to force a sale under legal pressure. We know it's coming. We don't know exactly when." He leaned forward slightly. "When it comes, we need to be here. Not after. Not in response. Here, with everything ready, so that when he walks into this ranch expecting to own it, he walks into something else entirely." "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You already planned for this." "I planned for the possibility," she said. "I've been waiting to know whether I'd have federal support or whether we'd be doing it alone." She held his gaze. "What do you need from me between now and when he moves?" Patterson reached into his coat and produced his own notebook, government issue, stiff-covered, and opened it to a clean page. "Tell me everything about Elbert Coombs," he said. She told him. She also told him about Tucker Marsh and the dark roan horse. She told him about the veterinarian's suspiciously fast report on the Kellerman bull. She told him about Dillard the lawyer and his rented office above the dress shop. She told him about the deed transfer timing and the 3 separate ranchers who had reported being approached by Reed with the same pre-announcement speech about the railroad confirmation. Patterson filled 6 pages of his notebook. When she was done, he closed it and looked at her with an expression that was, for a federal investigator, remarkably unguarded. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and you don't have to answer it." "Ask," she said. "You sent letters to Hargrove and to my office, and apparently to a newspaper reporter, all on the same day, weeks before you had any confirmation that anyone would respond. You built this documentation knowing you might end up standing alone with it." He paused. "Why?" Naomi was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the February sky was beginning to show, very faintly, the first pale suggestion of something that was not quite winter anymore. A thinning in the gray, a degree of warmth in the afternoon light that wasn't enough to feel, but was enough to see if you were paying attention. "Because someone had to," she said simply. Patterson nodded slowly, as though that answer had confirmed something he'd already half known. He stood and picked up his hat. "We'll be ready," he said. "We have people in Cheyenne, in Casper, and I'll have 2 men positioned in the valley within the week. When Holloway moves, I'll need 48 hours' notice if possible." "I'll do my best to give it to you," she said. He left the way he'd come, quietly, without drama, a gray-coated man on horseback disappearing down the road in the February afternoon. Naomi stood at the kitchen window and watched him go. And then she went back to the supply chest and removed the second copy of her documentation and began going through it page by page, adding the new details Patterson had given her about Western Meridian's structure and the corrupt land assessor in Casper, building the record higher and more complete. She worked until the lamps needed lighting, and when she finally heard Grant's boots on the back porch and the door opening behind her, she didn't turn around immediately. She was finishing a sentence. "You had company," he said. It was not quite a question. "I did." She finished the sentence, set down her pen, and turned. He was standing just inside the door with the look he sometimes had in the evenings, the day's work stripped away, the guard slightly lowered, more present in the room than he allowed himself to be in the daylight hours. "A federal investigator. His name is Patterson. He has a case against Holloway and Western Meridian, federal mail fraud. He needs our documentation to add conspiracy charges." Grant was very still. "You've been building this for him." "I've been building it," she said. "I didn't know until today that he existed, but I knew someone would need it eventually." He crossed the kitchen slowly and looked at the pages spread on the table. The weeks of careful entries, the dates and names and incident records, the copied deed transfers, and the cross-referenced timeline that mapped Vincent Holloway's operation against the valley like a surgeon's diagram. He looked at all of it for a long time. Then he looked at her. "How much danger are you in?" he said. The question was direct and quiet and held something in it that was not quite professional concern. She met his eyes. Less than I would be if I hadn't sent duplicate copies to 3 separate locations in Cheyenne, she said. Something moved through his expression, relief, and something underneath it that was warmer and more complicated, and that he didn't try to name out loud. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, the way he had that first day over the billing errors. And this time it felt entirely natural, the way things feel when they have become habit, without anyone deciding they would. "What happens next?" he said. "We wait," she said. "Holloway is going to move on the ranch. Patterson believes it will be a foreclosure document, forged. When he does, we need everyone here." She paused. "I mean everyone. The ranchers from the Alliance, Patterson's people, the attorney from Cheyenne, if Hargrove can get here in time." She looked at Grant steadily. When Holloway arrives thinking he's won, he needs to walk into a room full of every consequence he didn't plan for. Grant was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And you're going to let him think, right up until that moment, that it's working." "Yes." He held her gaze across the cluttered table with its maps of a finished man's crimes, and he nodded once, slowly, with the weight of someone who finally understood the full scale of what had been built in his house, by this woman in 14 weeks, without asking for recognition or reassurance or anything except the honest chance she'd arrived looking for. "Then we wait," he said. Outside, the night had settled over Ashmore Ranch in its deep winter quiet, and somewhere beneath the frozen ground, very slowly, without any announcement at all, the earth was beginning to remember how to be spring. The waiting was the hardest part. Not for Naomi. Waiting had never frightened her the way it frightened other people. She had learned, somewhere in the long, difficult years between her husband's death and the morning she stepped off a stagecoach in Black Ridge, Wyoming, that waiting was not the same as doing nothing. Waiting, done properly, was its own kind of work. So she waited the way she did everything else, with her eyes open and her hands busy and her mind running quietly beneath the surface of whatever she appeared to be doing. She sent the third letter, the one to Marcus Webb at the Cheyenne Daily Leader, on a gray morning in the second week of February, and this time she included a full copy of the documentation package. She wrote to Webb directly and without softening the language. What was happening in the Black Ridge Valley was a story, and when the moment came, she would send him a telegram, and she needed him to be ready to move. Webb wrote back in 4 days, faster than she had expected, and his reply contained 3 sentences that mattered and a great deal of journalistic excitement that she read past quickly. The 3 sentences that mattered confirmed he had verified 2 of her key claims independently through his own sources in Cheyenne, that he had a contact at the Continental Northern Railroad who had confirmed the spur route was in final approval stages, and that he would be on the next available stage to Black Ridge the moment she sent word. She filed Webb's letter with the others and told no one. Patterson's 2 men appeared in the valley quietly, the way Patterson himself had appeared, without announcement, without obvious federal markings. One took a room at the boarding house in Black Ridge under the name of a cattle buyer from Colorado. The second was installed in the Wainwright bunkhouse at Dorothy's invitation, passing as a hired hand. Naomi met each of them once, briefly, to confirm the signal. When the foreclosure document arrived at Ashmore Ranch, she would send Ethan to town with a specific message for the cattle buyer from Colorado, and from there Patterson's network would activate. She also sent word through Silas to every rancher in the Alliance. Not a meeting this time. A letter, hand-delivered, that said only, "Be ready to come to Ashmore Ranch on short notice. Bring anyone you trust." She did not explain further. The ranchers who had signed their names in the Cattlemen's Hall that December evening had enough reason by now to trust the instruction without needing the explanation. On the 18th of February, the foreclosure document arrived. It was delivered not by a process server, but by Dillard, Holloway's lawyer from the office above the dress shop, who came to the ranch in the mid-morning with Clayton Reed beside him and a buckboard driven by a man Naomi had seen twice before at the edges of Holloway's operation. Dillard was carrying a leather satchel, and Reed was carrying the particular expression of a man who expects to be resisted and is prepared to enjoy overcoming it. Naomi answered the door herself. She had seen them coming from the kitchen window while she was doing exactly what she had been doing every morning for weeks. The ordinary, unhurried work of the household, and she had taken 30 seconds to send Ethan out the back with a horse and a message. And then she had dried her hands on her apron and gone to the front door. Mr. Reed, she said. Mr. Dillard. Reed's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He had not expected the housekeeper to know his associate's name. We're here to see Mr. Ashmore, he said. Of course, she said. Come in. She put them in the front parlor, the room with the portrait above the fireplace, the young woman with her gentle smile, the infant, the younger Grant, and she went to find Grant in the barn. He was with Silas, and when she appeared in the barn doorway and said, "They're here," both men went still for exactly 1 second, and then Silas reached for his coat and Grant reached for nothing, because he was already ready, had been ready for days, in the way a man is ready when he has finally decided what he stands for. How do you want to handle it? Grant said, and the question was directed at Naomi. Let Dillard present the document, she said quietly. Let him finish completely. Don't interrupt, don't dispute, don't react. Just listen. She met his eyes. Can you do that? For how long? He said. Long enough, she said. He nodded. He walked past her toward the house, and his shoulders were straight and his step was even, and he looked, she thought, more like the man in that portrait above the fireplace than he had at any point in the weeks she had known him. Silas fell into step beside her as they followed. Patterson's man in town? He said quietly. Ethan left 8 minutes ago, she said. Silas made a sound that was, in its way, deeply satisfied. In the front parlor, Dillard had opened his satchel and arranged 3 documents on the low table with the efficiency of a man who had done this before. He launched into his presentation the moment Grant sat down. A smooth, technical delivery about the terms of the original Cheyenne bank loan, an alleged covenant violation in the loan documentation that Naomi had never seen referenced in any of Grant's actual paperwork, and a clause that Dillard claimed gave the lending institution the right to call the loan immediately under these circumstances. Western Meridian Land Holdings, he continued, had acquired the loan from the bank. Here he produced what purported to be a transfer document, and was therefore now the holding party, with the legal right to foreclose and assume the property in satisfaction of the outstanding debt. It was, Naomi observed from her position standing quietly near the doorway, a thoroughly constructed piece of fiction. The covenant violation was invented. The loan transfer document was dated 3 days ago, and Elbert Coombs's signature, which appeared on 2 of the 3 documents, had a quality she had noted from comparing it against genuine Coombs signatures in the ranch's banking correspondence. The pressure was wrong, the terminal strokes too deliberate, the signature of a man being copied by someone who was being careful rather than the natural carelessness of a man signing his own name. She had documented all of this in her notebook the previous evening when Patterson had sent her a message through the cattle buyer from Colorado, confirming that his document examiner in Cheyenne had looked at a sample of Coombs' genuine signature and would be prepared to testify to the forgery. Dillard finished. He folded his hands and looked at Grant with the practiced, sympathetic expression of a man who had rehearsed the expression in a mirror. Mr. Ashmore, he said, Western Meridian is prepared to handle this matter with discretion and to offer you a generous resettlement. Thank you, Mr. Dillard, Grant said. He had barely moved during the entire presentation. His voice was even and his face was composed. I'd like a moment. Dillard blinked. Of course. We can give you... Not with you, Grant said. Step outside, please. There was a brief, charged silence. Reed and Dillard exchanged a look. Then, because there was nothing else they could reasonably do, they stood and went to wait on the front porch. Grant looked at Naomi across the parlor. She crossed to the table and looked at the 3 documents without touching them. The loan transfer is dated the 16th, she said quietly. Patterson will want the originals. Don't let them take anything out of this room. Understood. He paused. Is everyone coming? They should start arriving within the hour, she said. He looked at her steadily. Are you ready? She thought about 14 weeks in this house. She thought about a worn travel bag and a burned coat sleeve and a notebook that had grown from empty to essential. She thought about Dorothy Wainwright's frightened eyes and Ethan's young face tight with anger and Silas Boone's long caution finally giving way. She thought about the letters she had sent into uncertainty and the answers that had come back, one by one, like people deciding to show up. Yes, she said simply. She went to the front door and opened it. Reed and Dillard were standing on the porch in the cold February morning, and Vincent Holloway himself was coming up the front path. She had not seen him before in person. He was perhaps 55, a well-built man in a long dark coat with a silver watch chain at his vest, and the composed, unhurried bearing of someone who had not lost anything he'd set out to acquire in a very long time. He had the kind of face that was not unkind in its features, but had been shaped, over years, into something that resembled kindness without containing it. The face of a man who understood that appearing reasonable was a tool. He looked at Naomi on the porch steps, and his expression registered her the way it registered the porch railing and the broken shutter that still hadn't been fully repaired, as part of the background, a detail of no particular consequence. "Is Ashmore inside?" he said to Reed. "I'm the one you want to speak with," Naomi said. Holloway looked at her directly for the first time. "And you are?" "Naomi Hale. I manage this ranch." She stepped back from the door. "Please come in." He came in because there was no reason yet not to, and because men like Vincent Holloway had a very difficult time taking seriously a warning issued by a woman they had already dismissed. He came into the front parlor and looked at the documents on the table and at Grant Ashmore standing beside the fireplace, and something in his posture settled into the comfortable configuration of a man arriving at the conclusion of a plan that had gone exactly as expected. The front door opened behind him. Silas came in first. Then Dorothy Wainwright, still in her riding coat. Then Tom Briggs and Carl Novak and James Kellerman, arriving together in a combination that had been impossible to imagine 2 months ago. Ethan came in at the back with 2 men in federal coats, Patterson's people, not Patterson himself, not yet. And behind them came Walt Harmon from the general store, who was also a county records witness. And behind him, utterly unexpected, was a man with a notebook and a press card who could only be Marcus Webb from the Cheyenne Daily Leader. Holloway turned slowly, taking in the room. The room had been the parlor of a grieving man's house. Now it was full, standing, shoulder to shoulder, with every person his operation had touched and failed to break. "What is this?" he said. His voice was still controlled. His face was still composed. But something had shifted in his eyes. A very fast recalibration. The look of a man running his plan forward and finding the outcome had changed. Naomi stepped to the center of the room. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "my name is Naomi Hale. I've been employed at Ashmore Ranch for the past 14 weeks. During that time, I've compiled documentation of 31 separate incidents affecting ranchers in this valley that I believe were coordinated by Western Meridian Land Holdings to coerce property sales." She picked up her bound documentation from the side table where she had placed it before Dillard arrived. "This documentation has already been provided to a federal land office investigator, to a territorial attorney in Cheyenne, and to the Cheyenne Daily Leader." She held it out, not to Holloway, but to the man in the federal coat on her right, who took it and produced his credentials in the same motion. "Federal Land Office," the man said. "Sir, I need you to remain where you are." Dillard was already moving toward his satchel on the low table. The second federal man placed himself between Dillard and the table without appearing to hurry. "Leave that where it is, please," he said pleasantly. "These documents," Naomi continued, her voice clear and even in the crowded room, "include the forged foreclosure you've just presented to Mr. Ashmore. The loan transfer is fraudulent. It bears a forged signature from Elbert Coombs, whose genuine signature pattern has already been assessed by a document examiner in Cheyenne. The covenant violation cited does not exist in the original loan documentation." She paused. "Copies of all relevant materials have been secured at 3 separate locations in Cheyenne. Anything that happens in this room today changes nothing about what those copies contain." That last sentence was for Holloway specifically. She watched it land. For the first time, she saw something real move across Vincent Holloway's face. Not the performed sympathy or the rehearsed reasonableness, but something underneath those layers that was older and raw. It was the look of a man who had built his entire operation on the assumption that the people he targeted were isolated and uninformed, confronting the fact that someone had been neither. "You have no legal standing," Dillard began, his voice rising. "This woman is a domestic employee. She has no—" "Mr. Dillard," Patterson's voice came from the doorway. Everyone turned. Daniel Patterson stood in the front doorway in his gray coat, unhurried, with 3 additional men behind him who wore the formal coats of federal officers and had the particular stillness of men who knew exactly what they were there to do. I have a federal warrant for the arrest of Vincent Holloway on charges of mail fraud and criminal conspiracy, Patterson said, stepping into the room. I also have warrants for Clayton Reed and for Gerald Dillard. He looked at the room with the calm of a man who had planned carefully and was watching the plan unfold. I'd ask that everyone who is not named in these warrants please move to the sides of the room. The room shifted. The ranchers pressed back against the walls and the furniture. Webb's pencil was moving. Dorothy Wainwright stood very straight with her arms folded and her eyes bright and hard. Holloway stood at the center of the room, and for a moment he was utterly still. And in that stillness, he was the most dangerous he had been all morning, because Naomi understood that a man like Vincent Holloway, at the moment of being cornered, was capable of reaching for something. She held her position and held his gaze directly, and did not look away. And whatever he saw in her face, the steadiness, the complete absence of fear, the calm of a woman who had been building this room for 5 weeks. Whatever he saw there, it was enough to keep him still. His shoulders dropped by a fraction of an inch. It was the smallest movement in the world. But she saw it, and she knew what it meant. "The men outside," Patterson said to one of his officers. "Reed's driver." "Already handled," the officer said. Patterson produced the warrant and read it in a clear, formal voice that filled the parlor of Ashmore Ranch and went out through the windows into the February morning and into the valley beyond, where the snow was beginning, very slowly, to melt at the edges of things. Holloway's men began talking before he was out the door. Reed went first, not with dignity, but with the speed of a man calculating his own exposure and deciding that cooperation was the mathematics of survival. He told Patterson about the Western Meridian structure, about the corrupt land assessor in Casper, about a second shell company that hadn't appeared in any of Naomi's documentation. Dillard, to his credit, said nothing, but by that point it didn't much matter. The documents in the satchel on the low table, the federal warrant in Patterson's hand, and the complete record in Naomi's bound notebook had built a case that did not require anyone's cooperation to stand. Holloway was escorted out of Ashmore Ranch's front door in handcuffs, into the pale February light, with the people of Black Ridge Valley watching from the porch and the yard. The ranchers, Silas and Ethan, Walt Harmon with his arms folded and his expression suggesting that he had perhaps underestimated Mrs. Hale on the day she asked about a buckboard to the ranch. Marcus Webb, standing at the edge of the porch with his notebook, wrote it all down. The aftermath came in waves, the way these things always do. The false foreclosure was voided the same week by the federal court in Cheyenne. The fraudulent deed transfers for the 5 Valley ranches were referred to the Territorial Attorney General for review, and within 6 weeks, 2 of the 5 had been legally challenged by the original sellers on the grounds of coercion, a process that Hargrove's office managed with the documentation Naomi had provided. The corrupt land assessor in Casper resigned his position before he could be formally removed. Elbert Coombs, at the Black Ridge Bank, was escorted to Cheyenne for questioning, and the bank appointed a temporary manager who, in his first week, extended Grant Ashmore's loan terms by 14 months without being asked. Webb's story ran in the Cheyenne Daily Leader under the headline, "Valley Fraud Exposed, Federal Charges in Black Ridge Land Scheme," and was picked up by 2 papers in Denver and 1 in Omaha. The story described, with a specificity that was somewhat unusual for the Daily Leader, the role played by the meticulous documentation assembled by the ranch's housekeeper. Webb, to his credit, spelled her name correctly. The valley repaired itself the way valleys do. Not all at once, not without scars, but steadily, and with the particular determination of people who had chosen to stop being alone. The Novak barn was rebuilt in March with help from 3 neighboring ranches, including Ashmore, including the Kellerman hands who had not previously been on speaking terms with Carl Novak about anything. Dorothy Wainwright's wells were cleared by April. The alliance that had begun as 11 names on a piece of paper in a cold hall above a hardware store became, by spring, something more organic and more durable. Neighbors who now knocked on each other's doors and shared information and helped without being asked, because they had discovered that the cost of isolation was higher than any of them had imagined. Silas Boone, who had spent 30 years earning the right to be skeptical, told Ethan Cole one afternoon in the repaired barn that in his opinion Mrs. Hale was the best thing that had happened to this ranch, and possibly to this valley, in a decade. And Ethan agreed with such immediate fervor that Silas told him to get back to work. The east bay of the barn was rebuilt with new timber by a crew of 6 men in the third week of April, and Grant worked alongside them every day. And on the last day, when the new frame stood complete against a sky that had finally, definitively become spring, blue and wide and carrying the particular warmth that Wyoming saves for April as though apologizing for February, he stood back and looked at it for a long time. Naomi brought lunch out to the crew, the way she had been doing all week, and when the men had settled on the hay bales and the fence rail with their plates, she found Grant still standing at the edge of the yard looking at the new timber frame. She stood beside him and looked at it too. "Your father built the original," she said. "With 3 other men and a lot of rope," he said. "Took them 2 weeks. He always said it was the hardest thing he ever did." A pause. "He also said it was the best thing he ever built." They stood in the April warmth with the sounds of the crew eating behind them and the cottonwoods along the drive showing their first pale green, and Naomi thought about a worn travel bag and a folded advertisement and a cold October afternoon that seemed, from here, impossibly far away. "Your plans," Grant said. It came out careful, deliberate, like a man who has been carrying a sentence for a long time and is finally putting it down. You could go anywhere now. Hargrove has offered you work. Patterson mentioned the federal land office. Webb would probably offer you something too if you said the word. He was looking at the barn frame, not at her. "You have options that weren't there before." "I know," she said. A pause stretched between them, long enough to have its own weather. "I'm not asking you to stay because the accounts need managing," he said, and his voice had dropped to something quieter and more exposed than she had heard from him before. He turned and looked at her directly, with the full, unguarded quality that he usually kept banked behind the gray-green of his eyes. "I'm asking you to stay because this ranch is different with you in it. I am different with you in it, and I am not—" He stopped, tried again. "I spent 3 years being very certain that nothing was worth the risk of caring about it. I was wrong, I know that now, and I'd rather say so badly than not say it at all." Naomi looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the man he was, not the closed-off widower she had met in an open doorway in October, but the one who had sat across a kitchen table from her at midnight and trusted her with his ranch and his name, and eventually, quietly, everything else. She looked at the new barn frame behind him and the spring sky above it, and the valley spread wide and green and finally healing. She thought about what she had come looking for in Black Ridge, an honest chance, nothing more than that. And what she had found in the finding of everything else was something she had not dared to name until this moment. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. It was not an elaborate answer. It did not need to be. Between 2 people who had learned to communicate in the precise and honest language of people who mean what they say, it was exactly enough. Something in Grant's face changed. Not dramatically, not the way things change in performances, but in the real way, the quiet way. The way a room changes when someone finally opens a window that has been shut too long. He breathed out slowly. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they stood there together in the April morning with the new barn behind them and the cottonwoods greening and the valley laid out around them, ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure. The woman who had arrived with one worn bag and no particular welcome had stayed long enough to build something, not just for herself, not just for Grant Ashmore, but for a valley of people who had needed to remember that they did not have to face hard things alone. She had not changed herself to earn her place here. She had not made herself smaller or quieter or more convenient. She had arrived exactly as she was, with everything she had, and she had been, quietly, persistently, entirely, enough. The spring moved across Wyoming in its unhurried way, greening the high pasture and softening the roads and filling the creek along the east fence line until it ran clear and quick over its stones. The cattle that remained on Ashmore Ranch were healthy and well-fed. The accounts were in order. The new timber of the East Barn Bay was pale gold against the older dark wood of the rest of the structure, the way new things always stand out for a while before they season into belonging. Silas Boone rode the north fence line every morning and found it whole. Ethan Cole was teaching himself to read surveying instruments, because Naomi had told him once over dinner that a man who understood land surveys would always have options, and Ethan was the kind of young man who paid attention to things said once. Dorothy Wainwright rode over on alternate Sundays and stayed for dinner, and the conversation at the Ashmore table was nothing like the silence that had lived there before. And on a quiet evening in late May, with the long Wyoming dusk laying its gold across everything, Naomi Hale sat on the repaired front porch of Ashmore Ranch with a cup of coffee cooling in her hands and listened to the valley settle into its evening sounds. The cattle moving in the far pasture, the cottonwoods talking in a low wind, the last birds going quiet one by one, and felt, with a completeness she had not known in years and had not been certain she would know again, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Not because it was easy, not because the hard things were finished, but because it was hers, honestly, fully, without apology. And that was the only kind of belonging that had ever been worth having. End of part 5. End of story.